This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview. Eric Deggans is easily one of the smartest journalists I know. Okay, I know some of you connect smart and journalist and chuckle the way other people combine military and intelligence, but trust me, Eric is really bright. He has his own way of looking at any topic and bringing aspects of it to light. Currently the television and media critic for the St. Petersburg Times, Eric is filling a job the newspaper created specifically for him. Before serving as media critic, he sat on the newspaper's editorial board and wrote bylined opinion columns, specializing in race issues, pop culture, media, and national affairs. From 1997 to 2004, he worked as TV critic for the Times, crafting reviews, news stories, and long-range trend pieces on the state of the media industry, both locally and nationally. Eric is also the president of the Tampa Bay Association of Black Journalists. And if you search his name on MySpace, you'll find he also worked in the 1980s as a professional drummer, touring and performing with Motown's The Voyage Band throughout the Midwest and in Osaka, Japan. He continues to perform in the Tampa Bay area with local bands and recording artists as a drummer, bassist, and vocalist. You may also recognize Eric as a recurring panelist on CNN's Reliable Sources. Eric, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thanks. I'm going to spend the next half hour disproving everything you said about me being smart.
Oh, I got to build you up before I start to tear you down.
Exactly.
Come on, you know how
Bring it on, pal.
You know how the media works. All right, let's start with a big question. If you could change network TV in any way, what would you do?
I would make the season shorter for new episodes, and I would more strictly enforce the decency guidelines, but I would make them looser at the same time. And what I would do is I would be a little more strict about trying to keep explicit content out of the 8 p.m. hour, the 8 to 9 p.m. hour in prime time, the first hour. But I'd relax it a little at 9, and I'd really relax it at 10, so that we'd see more FX and HBO type shows on network television, and they'd have shorter runs, so you wouldn't be forcing the guys from Lost to come up with 25 episodes of stuff when they really only have 13 episodes of decent material in them. We'd get more series, and frankly, I think they'd be better.
It's interesting that you brought that up. I'm thinking, we both have kids. Your view of these things changes once you become a parent.
Definitely.
10 years ago, I just found the 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock family hour, which it was really referred to then, as a real pain in the butt, because there was never anything on that I wanted to watch.
Right.
And now, in that hour, there's plenty of stuff I'd want to watch, but I can't because I got the 10-year-old daughter, and we've found you really can't watch pick a show. I mean,
right.
It seems like in this climate, for some reason, in our family first climate that we're in, and family values, that there's no respect for that hour anymore. Does that surprise you? And have you changed your views since you've been a parent?
I probably have changed my views a little bit, because if you're not a parent, then obviously you don't care when explicit content airs on television because it doesn't affect you. You're an adult. Once you become a parent and you're responsible for raising a child and sort of moderating and guiding their exposure to media, then it becomes more of a concern, because if you want to sit down with the family and watch TV at 8 o'clock, what do you watch? And that's the reason why these reality shows and these game shows have become so popular. Deal or No Deal, American Idol, Dancing with the Stars, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? One of the reasons why these shows are so popular is because the whole family can sit down and watch them without fear. It's a singing competition or it's a game show, so there's not going to be any cursing, there's not going to be any sex, and it's interesting enough that everybody in the family wants to watch it. Why the networks have not figured out how to do that with fictional programming, I don't know. My hunch is that sex jokes and curse words are an easy crutch for lame comedies and overly complex dramas. And frankly, I think it's possible to have to do a comedy where there's not necessarily a lot of sex, or where the language isn't totally explicit. I mean, I let my kids watch The Simpsons. I let my kids watch Seinfeld. I let my kids watch Everybody Loves Raymond. Those are all shows that have some sex in them, and they have some explicit words in them occasionally, but it's not a mainstay of the show, so I feel pretty good about watching it with them.
Raymond's a good example, I think.
Raymond is the best
too, because
best example.
It seems like on the whole it's a fun family show, and yet my wife and I, and now it's in repeats from like 7 to 8 p.m., so it's even earlier than the so-called family hour.
Mm-hmm.
But so many episodes start with Ray and his wife in bed, and he's trying to get a little something.
Exactly.
And that's the opening of the show, and my wife and I are sitting there looking at each other going, we should change the subject. So, Rach, what's new? What did you do in school today? And we're watching her with the left eye and the right eye. We're waiting to see if they've moved off of,
right. Well, I mean, from my standpoint, I've got a 2-year-old that's not very sort of, she doesn't pay attention to situation comedies. If it's not a cartoon, she's not interested. And then I've got a 10-year-old and I've got a 12-year-old. And frankly, by the time my kids at least are 10 years old, they know about sex, and they know that mommy and daddy have sex, and they know other people's mommies and daddies have sex. So if there's a scene where Ray and his wife are in the bedroom and he's making jokes about wanting to make love to her, they get that. They understand that.
I hope that usually it goes over their head. Since they're not at that point, that it's just kind of, it's like a lot of things that, as you go through the day, that it just doesn't strike them.
Well, I don't know. I mean, my experience with my girls is that they understand that, and they understand it in a way that totally makes sense. I mean, mommies and daddies do that, So they get the humor of it, and I mean, frankly, I'm much more concerned about them seeing really violent stuff on TV, really bloody
Plenty
stuff
of that at 8 o'clock.
on TV, than I am about the sex stuff. As long as the sex stuff isn't, what do I want to say, really crude,
right.
And as long as it's not really explicit. One of the problems we have, for example, is that we like to watch Law and Order reruns, and I don't let my girls watch that with us. Because there's too many mature themes in those shows, and what 10-year-old needs to be aware that there's elements of that kind of stuff in the world.
Well, it's interesting. I won't watch those shows because I swear it seems like every time, and my wife watches all of them. Every time I sit down to watch one, it's a story about a child endangered, a child killed, a child abused, a child molested, and I just think there's got to be something else that these scriptwriters are thinking about.
Well, I think maybe you just have bad luck because I watch them a lot. I watch them a lot, and I don't see a preponderance of those kinds of stories, but they do push the envelope in terms of explicit themes. So I don't let my kids watch those shows with me, but I do think we need ultimately broadcasters to be more responsible about when they use explicit content in their shows, and if they were, I have a feeling that they'd be allowed to use it more often, and they'd be allowed to introduce material that's more explicit. But the problem is we can't trust them. They put Friends on at 8 o'clock,
right.
And there's lots of curse words in it. There's lots of explicit sexual situations. It was a great show, and because it did really well at 8 o'clock, that just created a whole trend that we have just never been able to get away from.
It probably was the show that opened that.
It definitely was. It was a huge success at 8 o'clock. Spin City moved to 8 o'clock right after that, and both of those shows did well in those time slots. The next thing you know, even the slight hesitation that the networks had about putting explicit content at 8 o'clock went away.
Let's move to a related topic, something I think that is near and dear to your heart, and that is the
Bill O'Reilly.
Well, no, actually, we'll save Bill.
Okay.
The idea of the shrinking number of opportunities for actors of color in network television. You've written about it a number of times over the years that I can recall. Is it still dropping, and why is that an issue? And who should we be concerned with, the programmers or the people who watch, if it is an issue?
I don't think that the numbers are dropping. We had a situation probably 5 or 6 years ago where that was definitely the case, where show runners, the guys who create and oversee the production of network TV shows, the top producers, were telling me and telling other journalists, off the record of course, that they felt that if they had too many people of color in the casts of shows that they were trying to sell to the networks, that it would keep them from getting picked up. Now, whether or not that was true, the industry thought it was true. So you wound up having...
Perception becomes reality.
Well, perception becomes reality because nobody wants their show to be the show that got rejected. And if it gets rejected because there's too many black people in the cast, no network executive is ever going to admit it. So you'll never know that that's why your show got rejected. They'll find some other nonsensical reason. So people were just not casting people of color in pilots. And then what they were doing is they would advance the pilot and it wouldn't have any black people in it, or it might have one person of color in it. And then once the show was picked up, then they'd go in the back end and they'd add a couple of characters to try and make the show more diverse because they get criticized. And the problem with that process is that the characters never feel like they're part and parcel of the show because they've been sort of added on as an afterthought. So you had a lot of bad shows that had characters of color that were kind of grafted on, and they could have been interchangeable. They could have been anybody. And so it was awful because you had less people of color on TV, and then the roles that they were offered were awful. So, but what has happened since then is that the networks have kind of gotten religion about diversity. And as always, it's just taken the success of diverse shows. Lost was a big hit with a really diverse cast.
And almost impossibly diverse cast.
Yeah, well, if you buy the conceit that it's an international flight coming from Australia, packed with a bunch of different people, I could buy that it's a relatively diverse a crowd of people who land on this island. But yeah, they were incredibly diverse, just about in every type of person you can think of. Right? Yeah, but I'm thinking Heroes is more. Heroes is not quite the start of this trend. Heroes benefited from this trend. Okay. I would say it was more Desperate Housewives and Lost, and then Ugly Betty. And the success of those shows, Ugly Betty was just a reinforcement. It was really Desperate Housewives and Lost that came with casts that were pretty diverse, and they were blockbuster hits.
Wait a minute. I got to interrupt. Desperate Housewives was diverse?
Well, you had 4 leads, and one of them was a person of color, which for network television is pretty diverse. I mean, 25% of the core cast is... Eva Longoria is Hispanic. So...
okay, I think that's a stretch. I mean, I know she's Hispanic, but...
Well, it's not a stretch. She's Hispanic, and her husband was Hispanic.
I guess I was thinking of the season they introduced...
You're thinking about... Alfred Woodard.
Alfred Woodard.
Yeah.
And that seemed that introduction
that was
to that character
on.
Exactly. It seemed completely grafted on, and once they got in there, they tried in the worst way to make it as awful a match as possible.
Well, it's hard to know what happened there. Clearly they wanted to add her to the cast, and they had a core of 4 characters that the viewers cared about, and they tried to bring in this 5th person, and it just doesn't make any sense. But and Grey's Anatomy is another show that I forgot to mention that's also pretty diverse.
Now that's a show where it seems like it's been handled
and was very successful. Well, this whole issue is very complex. The good thing about Grey's Anatomy and Lost, they're the 2 biggest shows, and then also Desperate Housewives to a lesser extent, is that the characters of color are integral to the show. They have great storylines. They really matter. That's the great thing about the diversity on those shows. The bone I pick with Grey's Anatomy is that I think the race of their characters of color don't really matter. I think for the most part, the black characters on Grey's Anatomy could be white people, and it wouldn't make a difference. The Asian character on Grey's Anatomy could be white, and it would make no difference. And for I think many people of color, that's not how their life is. I think ER, as a matter of fact, has done a much better job of bringing in characters of color and showing how there are times when their race or their culture impacts their lives, and then there's times when it don't. And you look at the Greg Pratt character who's played by Mekhi Phifer, and sometimes the fact that he is a black man who was raised in the hood is has a significant impact on what's happening in his life. And then other times it doesn't. And then there's times when it has a small impact. And that happens because they've created a fully realized character, and that character reacts to different situations in different ways. And I think that's sort of the final barrier for diversity in television. We've gotten more characters of color in cast, but now they need to be fully realized, and we need to see their culture appear when it's appropriate. And because most of the writers in Hollywood are white people, they still, a lot of them have not figured out how to do that.
Let's skip around a little bit to something you've written a lot about, probably has no value whatsoever. However, American Idol, has it jumped the shark with Sanjaya?
No, not yet. In fact, I did an interview yesterday with Indian American Magazine, a writer for that publication, and of course they're interested in Sanjaya, and they asked me that very same question. And we're at a weird point in American Idol. First of all, American Idol gets a ton of attention because it is the highest rated show on television. And it's not only the highest rated show on television, it's split up into 2 and sometimes 3 editions in a week, and every one of those editions become the highest rated shows on television. And they also feed in a tremendous audience to shows that either precede them or follow them. So for the last few weeks, for example, the top 5 shows on television that week have all been either American Idol shows or shows that aired immediately before or after. So it's a tremendous engine for the Fox network, and so everybody's paying attention to it.
Eric, are you smarter than a 5th grader?
No, not based on those questions. But what I would say about American Idol is that because it's so popular, because so many people watch it, it obscures the fact that there are peaks and valleys in the contest itself. And what I've seen year after year after year is that when you get your 12 finalists or your 10 finalists, generally you have 5 people who are sort of serious contenders for the top, to win, and then you have 5 people who are there because of the strength of their personality, or because of the strength of their image, or because they have some kind of personal backstory that the producers and the viewers find compelling, whatever. There's 5 people there who are probably not going to be the top idols, but they're there to fill out the ranks of the 10 finalists or the 12 finalists. So that's where we are now. Those people are getting knocked off. And you could quibble about the order in which they're getting knocked off, but the fact of the matter is, all the people who are leaving now are all mediocre singers, and it's all about whether the audience is vibing with their image or not. So once Sanjaya once Sanjaya stays on the show, and people who are real contenders for the winning slot get ejected, that's when the show may have jumped the shark. But that hasn't happened yet, and there's really only 3 or 4 people among the 12 finalists who I think fit that category anyway.
Let's, in the time we have left, let's talk about a couple of things, a couple of quick things. Katie Couric, she's about 8 months in now. She's switched producers. You were fairly critical of that. How is she doing?
Well, she's struggling for an identity, and I think the biggest mistake that they made was not really settling on what do I want to say? They didn't really settle on a fully realized identity for her before the show debuted. They didn't figure out what the show was about, and they didn't figure out what she was about as a broadcaster, as a traditional news broadcaster. And they had months to work it out, so I don't understand why they didn't have this figured out. But they didn't. And so the show debuted, and they had some things they were going to try, and they had a few things here and there, but they didn't listen to, number one, their own research people who told them that they were going to get a huge initial tune-in, and then all the people who tuned in because they were curious about how she was going to do as an anchor would fall off and then be left with the traditional news audience. They didn't believe that, probably because the guy who's running CBS News came from CBS Sports. He hasn't been in traditional news for very long. And then the guy who was calling the shots before him, above him is Les Moonves, the president of CBS, and he's a brilliant TV programmer, but he doesn't know anything about TV news. That is his Achilles heel.
Eric, ultimately, do the three network anchor chairs, do the three network news shows at 6 o'clock each night, 6:30, do they even matter anymore? I mean,
yeah.
Do they really?
Yeah, they matter because in a fragmenting media universe, they are still the only platform that draws something like 25 million viewers every day. There aren't even that many websites that do that kind of traffic in a half-hour period. So, in fact, I would be surprised if there were hardly any. So it's still an incredible platform to reach people. It's a huge audience. And I think it's premature to give up on the concept of an evening newscast just because the audience is shrinking and people haven't figured out how to connect that show to a younger audience.
Sure. Let's talk about CBS's morning show for a moment.
Okay.
Renee Seiler let go
right.
in December, and then the awful thing, the coincidence of she had this double mastectomy.
Right.
What did you think about her being let go at the time? And as you look back now with a couple months, has your opinion changed about the situation at all?
Well, first I'll preface it by saying that Renee Seiler is somebody that I sort of view as somewhere between a professional acquaintance and a friend. We've met through the National Association of Black Journalists, and she's always followed my work, and she's always been really cool. And I've sort of been in contact with her since she left. I'm on an email tree that she sends emails about how she's doing. So I'll preface it with that, but I'll say that I thought it was kind of unfair and kind of crappy the way CBS handled it. They knew that she was going to have this double mastectomy when they decided to boot her off the show. Her family has a history of breast cancer, and her doctors suggested a preventative mastectomy as a way to ensure that she would that her risk of getting cancer would go down. And after years and years of getting biopsies regularly and being worried about lumps and all kinds of things, she just decided it was time to do it. So of course they decided to change the early show right when this happened, and frankly, there's 4 people on that show co-anchoring it, or there were when she was on it. Harry Smith is sort of the go-to guy. You can't get rid of him. He's the only one who can really handle hard news, and he's the only male. The other person, Julie Chen, is Mrs. Les Moonves. So you're not going to get rid of the wife of the head of the network. So that left Renee Seiler and Hannah Storm, and frankly, I thought they were equal. I thought they were both pretty lightweight. They both did sort of the same thing, and so they decided to get rid of Renee and keep Hannah. I guess CBS would say they thought that Hannah was more talented than Renee. I don't know. Frankly, I sort of felt like it would have been nice to kind of preserve the diversity of the show, and it seemed like all things were kind of equal other than that. So I probably would have kept Renee, but for whatever reason they let her go. And what can you say? I thought it was kind of a boneheaded decision to have 4 co-anchors on that show anyway. And that's another show that has been floundering to try and find its vision. But I wanted to go back to the Kirk thing for a minute, because what they needed to do was understand that they're going to have a huge influx of viewers, and then the viewers are going to drop off, and then they're going to be left with a traditional news audience, and they're going to get criticized because people are going to say that they failed. And if the network news audience is glacial, they take a long time to change horses. It took Bob Schieffer a year to build up CBS's evening news when he took over for Dan Rather, to the point where it was about 300,000 viewers ahead of when he took it over. It took a year to get to that point. And what happened was Bob came in, he knew the kind of broadcast he wanted to do, he started doing it almost from day one, and he kept doing it for a year. And people finally realized, hey, you know, this is kind of cool. And they migrated over, but it took a long time. What they've done with Katie Couric is they assumed that her celebrity would somehow speed up that process or overcome that process, and it didn't. And they didn't have a plan B ready, and they didn't have a clear understanding of what her image was as a news anchor. And what they should have done was figure out a vision for the show, debut it in September, and stick with it for a year. Make a few tweaks here and there, but the bottom line is you're going to get criticized every day, but it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if you run a marathon like you're running a sprint, by the time you get halfway through it, you can't finish. So, I mean, that's what I think Katie Couric's biggest problem is that as much as they say they don't listen to critics, they listen to critics way too much. and they're changing what they do based on, you know, somebody else, you know, there'll be a deluge of stories about 2 weeks of programming, and they'll make a decision about what's on the show rather than seeing it as a long-term game. And I've always felt from day one that was their biggest mistake.
Finally, Bill O'Reilly. No question.
Finally.
I just wanted to say his name and see how you'd react.
I always laugh when I hear Bill's name because he, like a lot of cable news guys, has this incredibly slick shtick that he has put together. And it involves presenting himself as the man who has all the answers. And the way you do that is that you know, you don't let any data or information come into your environment that contradicts your ideas. And he's very effective at that. So, you know, the only depressing thing about it is that polls seem to indicate that he's one of the most trusted journalists on TV, even though he's not a journalist. So, what are you going to do?
Oh, he's got as much credibility as the Onion News Network.
With certain viewers, he has way more credibility, unfortunately.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media this week.